Hey guys, welcome to this week's Wheel to Wheel podcast episode presented by Singularity Motorsports Racing Team with your hosts Jack and Danish. And in today's podcast episode, we'll be taking a look at how do regulation changes negatively affect more so actually, the fan base of motor racing. Okay, perfect. And without further ado, we'll dive right into it. So the first thing that we want to talk about in terms of, how do regulation changes really affect fan base in a negative way. The first thing we thought about was the entertainment versus technical proving ground aspect of it. This is something that we found interesting in the sense of how things are correlated within the world of motorsports, and motorsports obviously being different than other sports with frequent amount of rule changes from a year-to-year basis, more so than any other sport. And so this is something that we definitely talked about when discussing this type of topic. So I'll let Jack here talk a little bit about this topic and bring some points up to light here.
Yeah, motorsports is unique in the sense that it's one of the only sports in the world that has that technical aspect of it that the sport uses to drive technology forward. And when you're creating regulations for a sport, I guess my question would be, where does the onus lie? Do you want to make the sport entertaining, or do you want to push the boundaries with technology? And I think the regulating bodies are trying to walk that fine line sometimes. And sometimes they do go too far to one direction or the other with some of these changes, and it can negatively affect viewership, for example, right? Or the entertainment value provided by the sport. I think we see that with some of the aero stuff that comes up, right? I guess my question, what do you think, Danish? Do you think that some of the sports that we see, like NASCAR, Formula One, World Endurance Championship, do you think they've gone one way or the other?
I think so. I think more so they've leaned in recent years that I can recall towards the entertainment side of things. You can tell just basically, again, we'll come back to this topic, but for example, in Formula One, a big element featured about 8 years ago was the DRS element, the drag reduction system element, to, in aid of increasing overtaking, as, they weren't seeing a lot of overtakes being done on track. A lot of it was through pit strategy. And so they wanted the on-track action to improve, and so they introduced this element. Again, traditional fans and more hardcore enthusiasts found it more gimmicky, and we'll come back to that here in a bit. But that's just one example. Another example would be in NASCAR, for example, recently introduced stage racing. So stage racing, if people aren't familiar with NASCAR, essentially what it does, before you had long races, and so without a caution coming out, the race would essentially be green for the entire duration of the race. And so you'd have obviously 400 or 500 mile races. And so what stage racing does now, it breaks it up into segments and awards points for the top 10 runners at the end of each segment. And so basically what it does, again, more so traditional fans don't really like that because it takes an element of strategy in the long run out of the game if you don't have a caution. So you're just now forced to kind of do a sprint to each stage's end to get points, which will tally up towards your championship. So again, things like that, where, I find as well, I think the motorsport population in general and the series in general have leaned more, I think, heavily towards entertainment rather than what they were before, I would say.
Yeah, because none of those regulation changes, even if you go back further to KERS and stuff like that, they're not really, KERS I thought was uniquely technical in the sense that it actually forced you into a new system, a new way of thinking about your energy recovery and the car. But not necessarily can they bring a drag reduction system to the road. It's not like we're trying to create passes on the road. So these manufacturers that are involved in the sport, they're not really gaining a lot out of these technologies. So I guess as a regulating body, you really have to think about what the end goal is and who's going to benefit from it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think a lot of that comes down to, well, what is and I say motorsports as a broad category, but what is the goal for the different series, like you mentioned, like the World Endurance Championship, Formula One, NASCAR? What are their goals in terms of pursuing an audience, a target audience? I know in recent years, obviously, NASCAR tried to pursue the more casual fan. A lot of the rule changes that they made, for example, in regards to, stage racing or the car dynamics and how they behave, were geared towards the casual fan, trying to pick up the casual fan. So, does motorsport need to do that? And regulation change, I guess, comes from that type of background as well, in the sense that, if you're making regulation changes, you gotta think about, the fans, because without the fans, you won't really have much of a sport on a national level. So yeah, to your point, I think it is important to kind of blend the technical proving ground, make sure that, fundamentally the product, which is the car, and the track are in highest priority. And then including fans as well in terms of, getting them involved, getting their input, getting drivers' inputs, team inputs, before making these decisions.
Yeah, so I guess if you had to pick between the two, what would you lean towards?
Me being more, again, of a traditional fan myself, I'd lean more towards having more technical proving ground within the regulations. And what I mean by that, essentially, is if you're going to have regulations, they should be geared towards the design and development of the main product, which is the car, in any series. Obviously, you get points, not all regulations will be beneficial for the development and thus might make the racing a little bit more boring, per se, maybe more spread out. But I think if you have an organic product, which this would provide, in my opinion here, this would bring out the best within the teams and thus the best within competition of drivers and teams. And when you have a high level of competitiveness within a field, I think naturally the racing will just get better anyways. Or strategically it will get better. So, entertainment value will come when you have a sense of competitiveness. So if you go the other way around, I don't think that's necessarily the best approach.
We didn't plan this, but I'm on the other side completely. I think motorsports should be entertaining, because I think if I just follow the money, the money needs to go to from the sponsors to the teams, and if the teams need to get more value out for their sponsors, then they need more eyeballs, and if the sport is not entertaining, I think they might as well be doing this in a lab somewhere, right? And no one needs to be watching it. And so I think there could be some exciting technical changes that can be done out in the motorsport world, but I think the boring stuff should be kept to team development or company developments. For example, Mercedes does it secretly in their own bits, not at the racetrack, right? Because they're not going to get maximum value out of it. So I think the sports should mostly be about entertainment, especially in a world where we're seeing motorsports kind of dwindle a little bit, I guess the push and pull will be like, are we going to make it more niche? Are we going to make it more accessible? But I'm totally for the entertainment part. I could care less. Like if they ran the 1980s cars, but the racing was fun, I think that's what would keep the sport alive in my mind. But that's just me, though.
Yeah, no, that's a great point as well, actually, and that got me thinking as well here. Do you think there's a possibility then that we could take, the entertainment value that's provided in close racing, good side-by-side action, and really bring that element to the technical side of things, and with regulation changes, maybe showcase a little bit more of the technical expertise that goes into designing and manufacturing the cars themselves?
Yeah, and I think that brings us nicely to our next point about the transparency of behind the scenes and engineers and stuff like that. And I completely think I don't know if you really need to develop new things all the time. I just think maybe we should talk about the things that are being used, because frankly, the general public has no idea almost what happens behind the scenes. It's such a closed door system that nobody wants to really talk about some of the gains. But if we could see some of the behind the scenes stuff, who cares if it's a 1980s chassis? It still is cool, and we get to learn from it, right, as an audience.
Right. Absolutely. And I think more of the development, as we saw, through the Drive to Survive series that's popular on Netflix for Formula One, I think people are interested and curious, for the most part, in terms of looking at, behind the scenes and how things are put together. And even if they're not engineers, like, myself, for example, with very limited technical background, obviously I know components that make up, for example, a power unit in a Formula One car currently. But I don't know how they exactly work in harmony, for example. But I think I'd definitely be interested to learn a little bit more about what goes into, that aspect of working, in a garage. And so, I think that element, is unique to motorsports per se. And I think it would be, a lot more interesting to, add on as to the main product, which is obviously the racing itself. And I think it is unique because, if you compare it to other sports even, if you watch someone practicing, if they're playing basketball and you're watching, Kevin Durant or Michael Jordan practicing, basically, it's not the same, I don't think, intrigue that you'd find in terms of, how do you put an engine together after it's been blown up at a previous race. I think there's just a lot of unknowns there. And I think part of it, you're right, is, people don't want to give the competitive edge or advantage to other teams by disclosing information. But, maybe they design rules and regulations towards transparency, in the sense that, once, maybe, as you said, a season starts, you have your cars ready, you can't really make any fundamental changes, and thus you're able to disclose whatever you currently have. I think that would keep, obviously, the racing exciting, but the behind the scenes exciting as well.
Yeah, and I think people like to see what's happening behind the scenes, right? And Drive to Survive has kind of re-injected Formula One and some of the other series. Every time they make a documentary or a video and with behind the scenes footage, it definitely kind of increases the fan base engagement and makes them excited again. So I think it's nice to have. So the other part I think we wanted to talk about was the transparency of rules and making the rules simpler, right? I think when you have complicated things like, you can only have 4 cars out there or 6 cars out there in qualifying, and then you have 3 sets of these, but anyone in racing knows that tires and tracks are changing all the time, so what's the point? It kind of feels like it's a complicated system, right? So I think you wanted to mention some things about keeping the rules simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is based on, again, also my own experience in terms of, it's hard enough in Canada as it is on the West Coast to find really, diehard racing fans. But even through my friends that have watched some races with me at even the karting level, not to mention the races on TV, the most common comments that I've gotten were, this seems a little complicated. I don't understand what's happening. Like, I understand they're out on track. What does this rule mean? What does that rule mean? And you find yourself having to explain more of the rules than actually just watching the race itself and enjoying, the nature of just the side-by-side action. And I think that really does take away a little bit from the viewing experience. Because, if you're getting into motorsports, whether it's at a young age, old age, any age, and you have little to no background really in motorsports, you just think it's kind of cool and want to maybe dive into it a little more. It is indeed intimidating, I find, especially nowadays. Before, back in the days, I think the rules were a lot simpler, obviously. You had a certain point system. You just had to be consistent, get points, and the most points at the end of the year would win the championship. Basically, on a very fundamental ground. They still have that, but now you got, as I said, DRS elements. You got different track features. You got different car features. You have kinetic energy, part of it was kinetic energy recovery system, but you have that like on a whole new level, where you have to manage harvest energy with the ERS. And so I'm talking just on a Formula One level, but even if you look at other racing series around the world, NASCAR, even rallying, it's complicated. It's not very easy to follow. And so, I agree. I think in terms of simplifying the rules, they have to keep that in mind for if they're trying to attract and grow their audience and convert people from casual viewers to more hardcore enthusiasts. You got to do that by, first of all, I think simplifying the overall rules and regulations. Penalties, for example, I was looking at that as well. Very inconsistent in terms, and of course it's not the easiest thing to judge as well, being race stewards at a Grand Prix weekend. But some of them, for example, have been blatant collisions, in this past season where, you would expect at least a 5-second penalty and they call it a racing incident. And so just things like that, which, again, for a diehard race enthusiast, like you or myself, it's something that we can at least try and understand and get away with because, we understand more so the background of where the decision's coming from. But for new people, they want to be able to sit down, watch an exciting race, understand the basic rules, even of strategy, strategy involved, and just, enjoy a great race, which I feel currently the regulations don't allow it to happen that way.
I guess this is not even really about regulations. So the point that I'm trying to bring up is that when you sit down and watch these channels and these avenues that they're putting up these sports in, they're all behind paywalls and they're not really arriving at everyone's homes unless you're really looking for it. It seems like an opt-in option, which a lot of people, if you give them the choice, the world is so distracting, they're not going to opt in, right? So you kind of motorsports need to take the plunge and try to make it so that they're showing up on people's screens faster and freer, right? And that's kind of devaluing it a little bit, but also I think that's a long game. I think when more people watch it, more people get excited, it's on more people's minds, and therefore you can generate more long-term viewers, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something, again, I think they should focus maybe more on, and by they I mean the motorsports community in general, is to, keep the product in at least my opinion, the main product for providing the sport its value is the vehicle, regardless of the series. Without a proper vehicle that races properly, you don't have much of a sport in that sense. So if people find, for example, in NASCAR, they don't like the current car because you can't follow in dirty air, you can't race close because the aerodynamics affect you so negatively. Same thing with Formula One. It dilutes the product. And so the step in the right direction, which Formula One recently made, was, simplifying, for example, the aerodynamics. And so with that being said, obviously you can now follow cars, hopefully, that's what they're saying, based on their data results. You can follow more closely than before. And so, things like that, which again allow, a product where you get close racing, side-by-side action, people tend to not be then more focused on rules as well, in terms of, what's happening, but they just like to enjoy close side-by-side action.
Yeah, I agree. I guess when it comes to side-by-side action, one of the things that teams have kind of created is artificial passing, creating situations where cars are forced offline to get some energy boost that causes more panic and more action and more drama, or a DRS system that kind of gives you extra speed at the end of the straight that causes more passing. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something that more sports should continue doing, or should they do away with it?
Well, I think those are temporary solutions, and right. I say that with all due respect to obviously Formula One and the teams that design the cars around the regulations. The fundamental problem is the car following behind another car. And so the fundamental problem is the aerodynamics affecting a car following another car. And so DRS, for example, is just an aid to help you close the gap a little bit because they know you can't follow really in the corners. And so they've kind of implemented a gimmicky, as you mentioned, kind of an artificial way of overtaking because they know you can't keep up in the corners, due to the dirty air. And so they're not, again, by doing something like that, they're not focusing on the fundamental issue, which until now, I think they finally start to realize, what are ways that we can get more natural ways of overtaking. With, again, being, simpler dynamics. Simpler doesn't necessarily mean that they're slower too, mind you.
No.
But, I think engineers are smart people and they're always able to find ways to gain a lot of time back on the clock in a matter of a year. Even with the new regulation change, if you remove 50% downforce right now, I guarantee you in about a year or two, the engineers will be able to design a car that runs the exact same times as right now.
Maybe.
Yeah, I firmly believe, I think, based on the crazy design elements from, back in, I think it was the 70s or 80s with the rear diffuser, Ground effects, obviously, trying different things. I think people want that challenge. Engineers and teams want that challenge as well. And so to get back to your point, I think, they should move away from making rule changes that temporarily benefit the sport, and should focus more again on the fundamental product, which is if there's any issues with the racing, it's down to the car. It's not down to, changing the spoiler height per se, or, affecting things on the track to make the cars go faster per se. It's the car itself. So you have to address what the actual issues are with the car and change those and see, in a controlled experiment, how those affect the outcomes of the racing. But how would you say the regulations? Do you find gimmicky regulations to be kind of needed at this point in time, and how our world is heading, anyways, or do you think we should take a step back and analyze things from a different light?
I agree with you. I think it's a short-term life support kind of solution. I think you mentioned off air that regardless of kind of almost boring racing and one team running away in F1, they have increased their market cap, right? Like, so, I mean, does it matter? I can already see it in a boardroom, guys sitting around trying to make new regulations. They're like, well, what should we chase? Well, should we fundamentally fix the problem, or should we just kind of continue running the business as a business and make some more money off of it? I think the fans are leaving. I think the fans are kind of starting to come back because of some of the new tactics they're using, like Netflix and virtual racing and stuff like that, and putting the eyeballs back into the sport. But I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of the gimmicky stuff. I think it's neat, but I completely agree with you. If there's a fundamental issue with the car and the way the sport is run, then just address that. Don't beat around the bush and wait for I guess, like, to squeeze every ounce of value out of it. But I'm also not a team owner. I'm not trying to. It's not my livelihood. I'm just a fan, right? So I think I'm allowed to have that opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of it also comes down to, teams wanting to create, obviously, a financially sustainable model, which you mentioned, the cost cap. It's finally happening. And I say finally because I can't believe it's taken this long for them to institute something like that. But Formula One, at least now, I think, starting to understand that, costs can't be sustained at the current way that they're going, especially for the smaller teams. You see how Williams fell off the cliff basically from, I think it was 2017 to 2018. And during that transition, they really, really struggled, to basically keep up. And so now, a team like Williams, I think I was reading in the news recently, they're on their last reserves basically, financially. And so it's hard for me to believe that, a mammoth of a team like Williams from the 80s, 90s dominated the sport, to find themselves in that position now, where they might be forced to declare bankruptcy in that sense, is shocking. I mean, you can't have teams going under, and we've seen already even smaller teams from the past here, just recently, like Manor, Marussia, Caterham, all these teams that were funded relatively decently, to at least compete in the sport, they went bankrupt within a couple years. And so I think definitely the regulations should be forced to, again, simplify things, but to make things more organic rather than gimmicky. Think short-term. Rather than think short-term, think more long-term indeed.
I think one of the things that with the cost cap is that the amount of engineering budget, the amount of testing that goes into this. I think entertaining, like, I'm not going to lie, I don't think engineering makes the sport entertaining. Like, the race day of it. Might find you a second, but it's done so quietly that it's boring. It's not that entertaining. It's not going to help with sponsorship. It's not really going to help with viewers unless they come up with something that affects entertainment value, right? So I have a problem. It's like we take these sports with big budgets and say, hey, how do we solve this problem? And then we go out and hire all these engineers and build these engineering teams with test plans and all these things to find these to be competitive. But it's like, really, it's not really helping viewership. And so my question would be, like, why even bother? Like, I think, should we engineer anything? Should we just say everybody gets the same car and you don't need to engineer everything from scratch, and do we get a better sport because of it? Maybe. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great point. The engineering side of things, again, is something that, fans, I think, are curious about, but don't see enough of for sure in terms of the main product. I think it depends purely on the series for this one. I think, we have, the beauty of motorsports is there's so many series around the world, both on 2 and 4 wheels. It's incredible to see the diversity that we have from, sports cars, prototypes, Formula 1 cars, obviously, or open wheel cars in general, to stock cars, heavy cars, to even, truck racing. So we got, rallies in the deserts and stuff. So I think it depends on the series. And for example, NASCAR has always been known as, a stock series relatively. And so before, back in the day, for example, you would bring relatively what you had, to the track and work on it yourself, a little bit, but relatively everything else, in terms of the size, the width, the dimensions, in terms of, the engine displacement you can use and stuff were relatively the same for everyone. And so you had to differentiate yourself by, putting maybe, for example, pieces of tape on the grill to add more downforce. It was crazy, but I think that's something that produces close racing. It has produced close racing, like Formula E, if you see it today. They use basically the same, body kit, the same relative downforce, configuration, as well as the same power output as well. And so, as we've seen so far in its relatively short history, it's produced some of the best racing, as a result. The most unpredictable as well. And so I think people like that, and people tend to gravitate towards that because, people like unpredictability. They like a sense of drama. They like a sense of, close side-by-side action. So, to your point, I think Formula One even, a series that now has for decades been all about technical regulations and engineering regulations, should take a step back and again simplify the rules and maybe not go to a Formula E style where it's, the same body for everyone. But maybe give them, I was thinking about this completely, randomly, and, how can we solve this? And one of my thoughts was basically you have a central manufacturer like Dallara in North America. And they make, yeah, exactly. And they make various elements. So let's say they make 5 variations of the front wing, 5 variations of the rear wing. The key components, are all supplied, to all teams. And basically teams have an option to pick, different elements for their car. So yeah, it takes a portion out of the engineering in terms of designing it yourself, but teams are already buying it from the 3 big teams right now. Right? And so with its current structure, even if you have a cost cap in place, it still puts the teams that are buying from the bigger teams like Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, at still a disadvantage. Because obviously Red Bull's not going to say here, to, AlphaTauri, their junior team, here, just have a part that's better than ours, so you guys can stick it on your car. Like, they're not going to do that. But now if you have a centralized system where it's non-biased to the manufacturers, and of course maybe give certain elements of control to each team, like, a little bit in suspension or chassis design, but aerodynamically, for example, you keep the things consistent. And so again, it will allow some teams still the flexibility to, do things in a creative manner, with a more cost-efficient approach. But it would also make things, like aerodynamics, which plays a huge role, obviously, a little bit more centralized, which again would allow for close racing. Right.
I think you hit on a point earlier on, is that we don't get to see the engineering. I think we should change the regulations so that all the teams should absolutely put out engineering, like documentaries or videos or technical documents, and that'll explain and kind of bring to the viewers on TV what engineering they're doing, and some of the challenges they're facing. And that should be part of the regulations, because what it does is that all this money you're spending, you get to share it with your viewers, because ultimately that's your value prop, right? So the more eyeballs you can get, the more sponsorship you can get, right? Now Now maybe motorsport's moving away from that, but still, like it'd be good for the sport, right? It'd be good for the fans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on a point there as well in regards to, maybe keeping more eyes on the product itself, but also, again, giving a fundamental understanding to even the casual viewer that's maybe just tuning in. Obviously, there's a lot going on currently in the sport, even during the season. Obviously, you have updates that come in at different points of the season, people bringing in new parts, teams bringing in new parts, new things to try. And so it is hard if you're joining at the midpoint of a season to kind of keep up. But the goal should be, obviously you're not going to be 100% at it, but you got to be at least better than where you're currently at in terms of transparency again. So yeah, just simplifying the engineering regulations, but, it'll still be complicated enough for engineers to still have to figure out what are the best ways to make the car go fast. So I think it'll still add an element of challenge, but it'll also simplify things, as you mentioned, for the viewers, which is important.
Yeah, that's a good point. That to me kind of wraps up our kind of thoughts on regulations and how it affects fans. So basically, we're kind of split on if it should be a technical proving grounds or pinnacle of motorsports versus it should be entertainment. We kind of both agree on increasing transparency of rules and also behind the scenes stuff, more engineering exposure to the media. And I guess we're kind of also agreed on the gimmicky portion of it where we kind of don't like it, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And we definitely also would like to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts in terms of regulation changes, and do you view them as a necessity, or how would you improve them in its current format? So, we'd definitely love to hear from you guys, and make sure you like and subscribe to our channel if you like this video. And then stay tuned for more podcast episodes.